Hi, everybody. I'm Louise Richardson. I chair the Book Sandwich and Selection Committee, which is a terrific group of people. Lisa Derrickson, Dusty Hewitt, Hazel Russell, Margot Brown, and Pam Sonnefeld. We actually put together this year's program in 2 meetings, which I'm quite proud of. So thank you to them. Thank you to Barbara Cook for organizing our refreshments, to Marshall for tech, to the church here for letting us use this lovely space. And as always, to Card Carrying Books and Gifts, who were generous enough to have to print our postcards and give a book to each presenter. As I mentioned, I see new people here. That makes me really happy. Thank you. Some of you have heard this pitch before. Bear with me. It's budget time in Albany. And with budget time comes advocacy time. Libraries have been underfunded for a long time, and funding has not reflected the changes engendered by the advent of 21st century technology, nor has it kept up with inflation. Taking those factors into consideration, the New York Library Association estimates that New York libraries are underfunded by $45 million. So, what can you do about that? I have advocacy postcards here. If you haven't been to the library to fill one out or haven't filled one out earlier here, please stop by. It's easy. You need to write your name on it and the county you live in. There's a little bit of white space if you want to draw a little heart or say, oh, library is my favorite thing or whatever. Feel free to do that as well. Those will be delivered to our legislators, and they're being collected in all the libraries throughout Southern Tier Library System, which are 48 in 5 counties. But I am proud to say that Corning always gets the most postcards. So help us achieve that. I also have a sign. Many of you have had your picture taken with one of my signs. We have a new one now. We would like to have anybody who hasn't done that and would like to do that, see me after. Let's see. Kim is here. If you have not renewed your Friends membership, it's the best bargain in town. $5 for an individual, 10 for a family. And I know that they waive that if you give a generous donation to the library, but seriously, just pay it. Cheaper than a cup of the past couple of weeks, I've quoted authors Caitlin Moran and Neil Gaiman. I have a couple of new ones for you today. Walter Cronkite, the television news pioneer who was known as the most trusted man in America, said, whatever the cost of libraries, the price is cheap compared to that of an ignorant nation. And my favorite is from author Jorge Luis Borges. I have always imagined that paradise would be a kind of library. Today's book is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. We're happy to welcome Maria Strinni Gill. Maria has been a journalist, photographer, and amateur sociologist since high school. She feels fortunate to have earned degrees in those subjects in college and has spent 25 years putting them to good use professionally. She's currently a narrative storyteller and content producer in brand and experience at our local Fortune 300 company. And she loves her job. To mix it up a bit this year, I posed some questions I adapted from the New York Times By the Book column that appears in the book review every Sunday. In response to what is the first library experience you remember, Maria said, I never went to the library as a kid. I was a voracious scholastic book club buyer through middle school. And I didn't use my school's libraries until college. Then it was a place of dread, used only as a place to study and pour through card catalogs for research. I discovered libraries as a young mom. They were social gathering meccas for toddler programming where we could regularly find new books for our nightly reads. Some of my fondest memories of early motherhood were spent at Steele Memorial Library in West Elmira Library. She describes her ideal reading experience like this. At bedtime, in my bed, Generation Trauma, Cheaters on, and Siri, turn on my bed light. Thanks so much for joining us today, Maria. Oh, one more thing, sorry. Sorry. Just got this. Friday, February 9th. Friends is putting on an adult trivia night at the library from 7 to 8 p.m. And they promise fun, snacks, and prizes. So there you go.
Sounds good to me. Good noon, everyone. I'm going to hide behind my screen here, but I'm going to be sure to pop up and say hello every now and then to those of you who are blocking. I'm definitely a writer rather than a speaker. My words come better out of my hands than my mouth. So this is my little cheat. I am so excited to see old friends and all of you new friends. I don't think we can talk about this book today and not leave here as friends with what this book is about. So thank you for coming to share in this. Just to get a sense of who has read the book, raise your hand if you've had a chance to read the book already. Okay, and I'm certain that everyone else is going to need to read this immediately after we talk about it today. So what is Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, released by author James McBride last fall? If, like a typical reader who starts at the beginning of a novel, the first 3 pages will set you up for a classic cold case whodunit, a story about that whole who shot John business in Chicken Hill in Pottstown, Pennsylvania in 1925. The cops milled around for a while longer and eventually left, promising to return after they pulled the skeleton out of the well and studied the potential murder scene some more. They never did, though, because the next day, God wrapped his hands around Chicken Hill and wrung his last bit of justice out of that wretched place. Hurricane Agnes came along and knocked the power out in 4 counties. The nearby Schuylkill River rose to a height of 7 feet. To hear those old Black women of Chicken Hill tell it, white folks was jumping off their rooftops in Pottstown like they was on the Titanic. And them cops and big-time muckety-mucks that was running behind them Jews for the body that they found in that old well, they can't find a speck against them now. For God took that whole business, the water well, the reservoir, the dairy, the skeleton, and every bitty thing they could have used against them Jews and washed it clear into the Manatawny Creek, down into the Chesapeake Bay, and out to the Atlantic. And that's where the bones of that rotten scoundrel whose name is not worthy to be called by my lips is floating to this day. Boom. Okay. If, however, you are the kind of reader who jumps to the end of the book first, so you know how it turns out in case you die before you finish, the last 3 pages, the acknowledgments, you might prepare yourself to read an ode to a beloved Jewish camp director who founded a haven for disabled children outside of Philly in 1950 and ran it with care for 3 decades. James McBride, a half Black, half Jewish, 8th child of 12 from the Red Hook Housing Project in Brooklyn, spent 4 summers in the 70s working at the camp. And Cy Friend, director, made an indelible impression on McBride and so many others over those 3 decades. I've never met a more brilliant, more compassionate person, McBride writes of the camp director, who was also a Philadelphia principal during the school year. He was a slender, handsome man, a fast-moving object who slipped around the campgrounds like a spirit in clean white tennis shoes, shorts, and golf shirt, bearing an ever-present cigarette between his fingers and the melody of some spellbinding opera in his head. He knew the name of every camper, and often the names of their parents as well. He was decades ahead of his time. His staff looked like the United Nations long before diversity echoed throughout America. We were all poorly paid and overworked, but Cy left us rich. So this is a Who Shot John story and an ode, but it's also a work of thoroughly researched history about an integrated community in the 1920s, as well as an antidote for a painful family biography. What's more, in between this very compelling opening and a thoroughly satisfying ending is a story about love and community centering on the Heaven and Earth grocery store, whose name exemplifies those very topics: heaven, love, earth, community. So Chicken Hill is an outskirts Black and Jewish community of people who live in relative harmony in the 20s. Not so much because they want to or they're trying to, but because they have to. They're somewhat set apart from Pottstown, mostly white, which is mostly white and Christian, where the Chambers of Commerce and the Town Legions have the same members as the Ku Klux Klan. Their lives are interdependent, and in order to go about their daily business of living, they accept the differences in their culture and they adopt various aspects of each other's. So the book opens in 1925 with Moshe Ludlow, a Romanian immigrant who owns a small theater, and his wife Chona, who runs her rabbi father's shop, the Heaven and Earth grocery store. After a 4-night run of a dazzling klezmer band, Moshe and his hired hand, Nate, a Black Chicken Hill resident, are cleaning up the theater when it occurs to Moshe that his neighbors like Nate have no place to go for such a good time as Moshe himself is able to provide. So with Chona's support, she's always one to poke a stick at the wrongs of the world, he decides to open his doors to all, and while the town's forefathers, who all act as if they themselves stepped off the Mayflower, freak out. But Moshe becomes so successful, he opens a second theater. Now, Moshe and Chana are doing quite well within 5 years, and Moshe wants to join the other up-and-coming residents in an exodus out of Chicken Hill, which is indeed sort of a wretched place with the water, their access to water is inconsistent, and they're just making do in so many ways. He wants to move them off Chicken Hill into the more well-to-do Main Street neighborhoods of Pottstown proper. But Chona won't have it. She is tied to that Heaven and Earth grocery store and their apartment above it. And Moshe just wants his wife with her left foot shriveled from childhood polio, which was never for a moment off-putting or unattractive to him. He wants his wife to have everything and to not have to work so hard, toiling all day in the store with her bad leg, which, to be honest, never slowed her down for a minute. But Chona won't have any of it because this store is so much more than a store for the Jewish and Black Chicken Hill residents who frequent it. And Chona is so much more than the shopkeeper who runs it. The Heaven and Earth grocery store is the center of community, and Chona herself is the center of that community. It's a good thing that Moshe has found success in his theater pursuits because it affords them the lifestyle to go on, because the grocery store is not exactly turning a profit. Everyone shops there. Not everyone can afford to pay. And Chona is not the type of person to let someone in her community go without. When they need it, she lets her customers purchase their goods on credit, never bothering to write down a single purchase or keep track of a debt. But she doesn't need to, because she is the kind of person she is. Her neighbors will always pay her back as soon as possible, and they'll enjoy doing it. But still, she purchases extra just to be able to give it away. She keeps a supply of marbles so that she can delight the children. Back in the days when you could delight children with a marble. Wow. Chona is love and community, heaven and earth personified. Okay. Chona and Moshe employ and befriend Nate Timblin and his wife Addie, who took in their deaf orphaned nephew, affectionately called Dodo. Chona quickly develops a deep fondness for this boy. And when the state comes to institutionalize Dodo in a hideous, villainous asylum, Chona hides him in her home and she cares for him as her own. Chona battled most of her adult life with various illnesses, and she is mid-seizure and unconscious when Dodo is discovered in the store by the handsy Klansman town doctor. Dodo sees the doctor violate this very vulnerable situation, and the doctor must do what he can to prevent Dodo from telling. The police come, a chase ensues, Dodo is captured. The whole town rallies around Chona and mobilizes to spring Dodo from this prison. Elaborate plans are made, everyone does their part, if not for the boy himself, but because they love Chona so much and she loves him so much. I have come to learn that this is a recurrent theme for McBride, that nothing of significant value is accomplished alone. Nothing important is accomplished without love and community. I think McBride had Chona on his mind well before he ever dreamed of this character or formulated this plot. Going back about 30 years to 1995, when he burst onto the literary scene with his autobiography, The Color of Water. In this critically acclaimed work, McBride set out to learn all he could about his larger-than-life but very tight-lipped mother, the daughter of Jewish grocery shopkeepers in Suffolk, Virginia, whose family sat shiva for her when she married his Black father. Imagine that. McBride's mother never spoke of her family, and he knew very little about his Jewish side. She became a devout Christian and helped his father establish a New York City church. So the Jewish ancestry and the religion they were both lost to him. He also never knew his father, who died during his mother's pregnancy. So he had a lot of questions about who he was. On a quest to learn about the matriarch who raised 12 children from 2 deceased husbands, the former journalist approached his mother in a very candid interview, which he documents in The Color of Water as he figures out his own feelings about who he is, and he unravels the mysteries of where he came from. From this, he finally learned of his mother's Jewish upbringing, the abuse at the hands of her rabbi father, and that father's disregard for a wife he never loved. So his mother painted a picture in his mind of his grandmother, the shopkeeper's wife, disabled by childhood polio, who ran the store while her husband served as religious leader to the small community of Jews who lived in a predominantly Black town. Chona is so very clearly based off these stories of the grandmother who died before he was born. She gave like Chona gave, but she never received the love that Chona got back in return. This must have weighed on him all these 30 years since The Color of Water. He conducted meticulous research, investigative research in Suffolk, on polio, on his lasting effects, on Judaism, on Pottstown, on the Romanian theater owners around Pittsburgh. I mean, he researched like a journalist and a sociologist. We learned these customs that his family would have participated in. And in Chona, he collided the baggage of ancestral biography with the power of narrative fiction to correct the past and give his grandmother the biography she should have had, the love and community, the heaven and the earth that she deserved. McBride's own grandmother died relatively young, as did Chona, and I think it must have cut McBride to the core when he went back to Suffolk, Virginia, to find traces of his grandmother's life there. And he found no legacy. Her loveless marriage prevented her from making a mark. No one really remembered much of her. And we're talking, they were at the center of this community, the owner of the shop, the rabbi's wife. No one had much to say about her. Chona, however, the people of Chicken Hill remembered Chona when she died. When she passed, her Black Christian neighbors sat Shiva in mourning. Her spirit brought together some of the most unlikely, most curmudgeonly immigrant men to found a summer camp for disabled children in her honor in the Pennsylvania Hills. Her kindness would be remembered, and her spirit of love and community would endure for generations. Okay, so in Heaven and Earth, you have the convergence of two stories rooted in history, plus all that Who Shot John business, plus the ode to Cy Friend into one theme about love and community, heaven and earth. So the story started with a desire to write a book about Cy Friend, but McBride realized that a book about a children's summer camp and its director would quickly become entrenched in stories about the kids, about the daily activity and routines of a camp. But he wanted to tell a story of love and community in a way that fed the essence of Cy into a story that could have happened in the hills of southeastern Philly, where the camp was. And southeastern Philly, because he originally started looking at Pottsville outside of Pittsburgh, which has a well-documented history of Blacks and Jews living together in relative harmony at this really fraught period in time. Then he discovered, on his travels, he discovered Pottsville and found Chicken Hill. And he found a synagogue that was sharing space with a Black church. And he realized that this interconnectivity was happening so much more than our history tells us. And that was really one of the main reasons that he wanted to write this book. He was looking for that intersection in his own life, and then he found it, that it actually existed, and we just don't know enough about it. That is why we're in southeastern Pennsylvania for this story, rather than Suffolk, where his grandmother was actually from. So by blending and twisting this actual history bent on the theme that Cy embodied, McBride pulls off a novel, a work of fiction that's about as true as anything as I've ever read. So this is really cool because I've really been able to talk quite a bit about this book without even really telling you what happens in it, but rather what it is about. As I kind of wind this portion of prepared statement down, I must mention that as Chauna's love and community endured for generations, so did little Dodo's, far beyond anyone's expectations. And since some of you might like to know the end, just in case, and because I've yet to address one of the best things about this work, McBride's rhythmic phrasing that reverberates throughout the story, I just have to speak of it. It gives evidence, line after line, of McBride as the jazz musician that he is. So I will leave with this closing passage. He died on June 22nd, 1972, the same day Hurricane Agnes wiped much of Pottstown off the face of the earth, and a day after an old Jew named Malachi the magician vanished forever from the hills of southeastern Pennsylvania. And as he faded to eternal slumber, surrounded by loved ones just feet from the sunflowers and summer moss that had helped wipe away the tumult of his first 12 years of life, he would offer 4 years in his final murmurs that were a puzzle to all that knew and loved him and surrounded him in his final moments of life, save for the one who was not there, who was far beyond them all, now living in a land where the lame walked and the blind could see, who awaited him even at that moment as he drifted upward, eager to hear the news of the many adventures that had befallen him since they parted ways. It was to him that he spoke, not to them. He called out, I'm not going to tell you. But I wanted you to at least have that before you leave this mortal coil. But now you'll just have to go back and start at the beginning. Thank you very much. So, what should we talk about now? Are there any questions from those who have or haven't read the book?
It's us very popular because I'm trying to do it at Steele Memorial Library. It makes sense for the people. So.
Yes,
You're done.
It certainly is. Our audience member, what's your name? Marianne has indicated that it must be very popular because she's been told if you're trying to get it from the library, fat chance. It was probably a little nicer than that. But I will tell you this, I am not a collector of things. I don't like to dust. I don't like things that sit somewhere. And while I love books, I don't like to keep a lot of books that I've read. You have it on my authority that you should just go buy this one and keep it on your shelf. This is worth it. It is a good book to have. My dog tried to read this with me. It's got dog-eared pages as well. And I'm gonna keep this on my shelf. Because I just feel better knowing that's sitting there in my living room. In the back.
I haven't. I know. I think. We have to figure out what the skeleton is.
You do. As I said, compelling beginning, thoroughly satisfying ending. You feel good about this end. And it's kind of unique because on one hand, yes, it is perfectly packaged. The questions get answered, the things get solved. He ends up achieving, the author ends up achieving so much about what he set out to do and what his mission evolved to as he began writing. He really gets to the heart of everything. But it's also in a way that everything that happens just smacks of real life. Things don't happen in a perfect cadence. It's like weird coincidences and ironic things where people just get their comeuppance. Like nobody could have predicted this really weird course of events, but darn it all, if it is just not the right way for things to have played out. So yeah, super satisfying in the end.
I just had a couple of comments. I think one thing that I saw was that it was listed as the #1 book of the year by Amazon, which may be one of the reasons why it's so hard to get as well. And I listened to it.
Mm.
And the narrator is wonderful. So if you get an option or you like to listen to, listen to books, it was really well done.
Awesome.
The accents really well.
Awesome. Is it James McBride himself who narrates? No. Okay. I was thinking about this. A friend of mine mentioned this on the way in, or maybe it wasn't, I can't remember now if it was a new friend that I made today or an old friend, but either way, whomever it was said they were thinking about listening to it. Is that you, Pauline? And I really had to go and I was like, wow. Having read it, yes, because there are dialects that you have immigrants from Romania and Germany, and you have this crazy Russian dancing Jew that I just am dying to know how exactly he spoke. And it would be a delight to listen to, I'm sure. But also the way James McBride writes with that rhythm, the way your eyes dance over the words is so lyrical that there is a voice in my head the entire time reading this book to me. So I would have to think that either way, whatever way you consume it, is going to be great.
So I read it when it first came out, and I would suggest that to savor the language, but then this was coming up, so I thought, okay, this time around I'll listen to it. It's a great recording. One thing that struck me, however, is they didn't read the acknowledgement. So I don't know if you're one of those people who skips over the acknowledgements of books because usually they're fairly pro forma. It is the best one I have ever read.
I'm the same. I skip all that. I usually don't read the prologue. I usually don't read the acknowledgements. But when I flipped to find the end of the book, just in case, I found the acknowledgements, and from the first sentence, I wanted to read the acknowledgements. So it was very, very interesting. And it really, I did not know where this book was going to go. After reading the introduction, after reading that acknowledgement, I just,
The parts in the middle are so good, you almost completely forgot how the story started until it got to the end, and I was like. "Whoa."
there's, and that action to discovery of the setup is very fast paced. The majority of the book, you are learning about this place and this time period and these people and their connections and their motivations and their wants and how they navigate through the world, through a racist, classist world. And you really are not thinking about that dramatic setup. And then all of a sudden it hits you and you're like, ooh, this is picking up. I think I'm going to find out who this is. Wait, is it this person? Maybe it's this person, because they both deserve to go. Okay. So who is it actually? So it's yeah, it's really good.
For those of you waiting for the audiobook, I just reserved a copy. 26 weeks. What's however long it takes me to get through?
We could schedule a weekly event where we sit in a circle and we all just read a chapter to each other. That would be really fun too.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing the background of the author, because I think that pulled together, because one of the comments I had about the book was that there were just bits and pieces, like what happened to the protagonist? And then the protagonist changes in the middle, and so there's like pieces of it, and they're his life. All those pieces are his life. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'm going to research that author more. And then I just want to say that I have started reading the acknowledgement at the beginning of books now, because they sometimes tell such a great story. So I read like the first chapter and then I'll say, so where'd this come from? And then I go read the acknowledgement. Sometimes they're worthwhile and sometimes.
Well,
So thank
yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. As soon as I put this book down, I think I would have done this even if I wasn't preparing to speak to you all about it. I immediately had to go, Google James McBride and find out more about him. I found the way he, like, this is very writerly in that he tied those things together so well and used bits. I'm fascinated by like generational trauma. That is really that's what I gravitate to when I read. And much like James McBride, I think those of us who do that, right, like the psychology majors who are really trying to solve their own stuff, I when I'm reading these generational traumas, like Isabel Allende, House of Spirits, or I can't remember the name, Fall on Your Knees. Did anybody read Fall on Your Knees? Yes. Beautiful book. Like, I think we know that trauma of the ancestors who came before us, like, gets burned into our very DNA, right? And our neural pathways of how we grew up. And you seek to answer when you're reading things like that, you can apply them and you seek to answer, like, gosh, why is my mom so tight-lipped? Why don't I know anything about my mother's very much the same. I don't know anything about her. This woman that raised me, I know nothing about her. And when you go into these stories and you think about all the things that play into that, and you begin to imagine, like, I have written my mother's story in my head a million times. That's what I do when I'm driving down the highway. How could this have played out? What could have made this behavior? And I think, to see an author so clearly doing that, and so many times I'm sure that happens with authors, but we don't know about it. But because I looked at those interviews, you know, with the New York Times and whatever, I read about him, I listened to some of his interviews, I immediately had to read The Color of Water. So and that I poured through as well. And I'm so glad I did, because I just could not have imagined how much that work informs this one. And it was a true delight to be able to read them in tandem.
Thank you.
Read the book yet. But I have to say, up until about 8 years ago, I was a resident of Philadelphia. Poor town gets a bad rap. But I was really happy to hear that there was a wonderful camp in southeastern Pennsylvania that I didn't know about. But thank you for reminding me things about my birthplace.
Go Philly. It's like, my supervisor at work is from Philly, and he always gets he always gives a shout out. He like punches up at Philly, but he's a proud Philadelphian as well. So I was kind of imagining his voice and him in there. I could almost see Cy Friend. I could see my supervisor Billy as Cy, kind of bopping around in his white tennis shorts, like the opera going on in his head with the cigarette, you know. Sorry, Billy, I was envisioning you as Cy.
Yeah, when I read it in 2 nights, these past 2 nights, I read that. So I'm gonna be taking the book back to the library today, so.
You might want to follow. Just follow her.
So, yeah, so when I was sort of digesting it, I think as I was falling asleep or when I was waking up this morning, not sure which, because they were very close. Um, what struck me was, and you mentioned it, the musicality of this book. And, you know, a lot of times you'll read prose and you'll think, oh, it's very poetic prose. I never thought it was poetic, but it was musical. There was a big difference. The other thing that really struck me was that this is probably the best example of, well, first of all, there were so many characters. And at first you're kind of overwhelmed with trying to keep track of who's who and whatever. But it was the best example of, like, it wasn't wasted at all. It wasn't superfluous. It wasn't, they all were part of that story and it was woven so well together. Yeah, I don't think I've read another book that I could say that about, because oftentimes you're like, well, I'm not sure why this person was there, because anyways, but yeah, but there's no waste of character, I don't think, in there.
Yeah, you're right. And these characters are so human. They're not perfect people. They're flawed. They have shortcomings, and you know, the way they connect though, and that's really kind of like what the community is. I think, like, so often now, like maybe always, I don't know, people try to be perfect. They try to be so perfect. And we live largely outside of community, right? Because we don't depend on each other the way that we used to. Like, we depend on Walmart more than we do on our neighbor down the street, right? And so the shortcomings of the characters are made up for by their neighbors who are pulling them along and helping them along. So like that having to be perfect, like there was much more an acknowledgement, I think, in this book, an acceptance of, yeah, the old Jewish shoemaker is a really grumpy dude. You wouldn't really expect him to help found a camp in honor of Chona, you know, but the way that they connect and come together is just, they build on each other, and you could get some really fine character development there.
And just the last thing I want to say,
Yes.
is I love the relationship between the 2 boys.
Yeah.
Just so sweet, right?
Yep, you're gonna have to read to find out about that. I didn't want to ruin it for you. Yeah, it's something.
Bucket cart carrying.
Yes.
And if you do that, please tell them we sent you.
Yes.
So I did forget to tell or ask everyone if you could just bring your chair at the end over to the rack there. We need to put them away, except for 12, we leave 12 out. So I didn't have quite the same experience as Barb. I knew who those characters were in the get-go. They were so well defined to me.
Yeah, I would say I definitely felt that way as well. I think maybe what I can relate to what she's saying in that some of the intricate connections of like the juke joint owner who is sisters with the neighbor of Chona, who basically, you know, Chona could stash Dodo in her yard because she had so many children that another one would not be noticed by passersby. So I think the characters themselves were extremely unforgettable, unmistakable, but how interconnected they were, I think is where you almost, you kind of need a chart. Like, wait a minute, isn't that his mother who, you know, that kind of a thing.
Also, I guess this is my favorite book of last year. And if someone had told me that, my favorite book of last year would be a book in which Hurricane Agnes was
Right?
having lost our house. She's not my friend, but she was a bit of a heroine.
Yep, she washed away that whole Who Shot John business, that's for sure.
Okay, we do have one more event we'd like to invite you to. Friends are offering a craft session on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday,
Oh,
from 4 to 6 with Ann Drake, who is one of our resident guru, along with Kimberly. We are reusing old pages to make Valentine's crafts. And it's open to anyone, no registration, and we will have all the materials.
beautiful.
Great, thanks, Maria. I always felt.
Thank you.
And one of the little applications last year, book that I really wanted in the lineup was Fight Night, which is my favorite book of the previous year. And then this was my favorite book, and I always think, they don't like it. It's still be fun. So,
Thank you for
yeah.
picking me. That is a high honor that I got to read Louise's favorite book, so